Jimmy. Who are you going to fight against when this balloon of yours goes up?
Forces of anarchy, wreckers of law and order.
See?
Communists, Maoists, Trotskyists, Neo-Trotskyists, Crypto-Trotskyists, union leaders, communist union leaders.
See?
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Hi, Austin. So you're going to be here today to talk to us about Byung-Chul Han. Now, Byung-Chul Han is a German-Korean philosopher.
Yep.
And I was wondering, could you just maybe begin by telling us a little bit about him or offering a little character sketch?
Yeah, so this is the tricky thing, because for one, he is quite an elusive figure. Apparently there are these anecdotes that he'll tell reporters to not record him with their tape recorders, and he doesn't really do public appearances. Like, you would never see him doing, like, I don't know, some sort of YouTube series like Jordan Peterson with a Patreon trying to raise money. I mean, he doesn't seem to want to have a very large public persona or like a social media presence. And I think that kind of fits into his philosophy. So he's a little bit of a mysterious figure. And there are interviews and articles that have been done with him or written about him, but they all seem to report the same thing, that he's kind of this enigmatic, mysterious philosopher. He's Korean-German, so he moved to Germany in, I believe, the 80s, and he did his PhD on Heidegger at Freiburg. And then he is kind of, people lump him together a lot of times with Marcus Gabriel as being sort of on the, maybe the vanguard of these new emergent German philosophers who are gaining also some level of popularity with regards to their work, that it's kind of demystifying the complexity of German philosophy for a lot of people. So apparently a couple of Byung-Chul Han's works have been widely read, both in Germany and actually apparently in Latin America, where I guess that a lot of his works have been translated.
Okay, so he's quite popular in South America, Latin America, and Germany.
Yeah, and I mean, I believe his works have been translated into quite a few languages, but I don't think he has as big of a following. He doesn't have much recognition in the English-speaking world yet. I know one of his books was published by Verso. I believe it was the Transparency Society, but or maybe not. Maybe it was a different work. I can't remember which, but regardless, he just doesn't seem to have as much notoriety in that world yet.
Okay, so so we haven't seen him or heard of him that much in the Anglophone world, in the UK basically, or the United States. What do you think explains his appeal then? What do you think explains his appeal in Germany, or why is he popular? You know, if he's being read sort of outside beyond the academy, and if the same in Latin America.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. One, at just a superficial level, his books are all really, really short. So they're in the 35 to 50 page range, which means that they're extremely accessible. But I mean, and I think that's appealing to people, obviously, rather than, you know, reading some 5-volume text by Sartre that's 1,100 pages that he never finished or something like that, which is just daunting, right? So I think that there's an appeal at that level. And then I think more substantively, the reason that his work is so appealing, and at least why it's so appealing to me, is that he, one, is tackling issues that are very pressing for us post financial collapse, post 2007, 2008. He talks obviously a lot about neoliberalism and something that he's termed the achievement subject or the achievement society. We can talk about that in a minute. And also he has termed our age, this sort of postmodern, neoliberal, late capitalist epic, if you will, the Burnout Society. And these themes seem to really resonate with people who are dealing with trauma, anxiety, depression rates are increasing, sort of pharmaceutical use is on the rise. ADHD, what he would call like hyperactivity, seems to be something that is a direct consequence of these political economic tensions. And I think it kind of resonates with people. And he does it in a way that maybe it's because he did his work on Heidegger, but it's got like a real poetic flourish to it. And so it's very enjoyable. Like in his book, The Agony of Eros, the first chapter is it's kind of, I guess, an analysis. It's not really an exposition, but it's a sort of conceptual analysis of Lars von Trier's Melancholia. So he's also using media images and cultural theory and cultural studies and media studies alongside rich traditional philosophical analysis.
Okay, so if we're going to try and explain sort of his core themes of his work, you mentioned Heidegger there. So Heidegger, German philosopher, one of the big German philosophers of the 20th century, he seems to be quite influential on Han. And Heidegger was someone who, as his work progressed, sort of was a thinker who existed in the sort of the nexus of poetry, philosophy, literature. Right. And obviously he has this critique of technology as well. Is that where Han takes his jumping off point?
I think so. Yeah, I do think so. In the preface to Agony of Eros, Alain Badiou actually writes the preface. And the kind of theme of the text is that in our world at the moment, the late capitalist, neoliberal, postmodern world, love has become impossible. And this is what he calls the agony of Eros. And it has to do with what he sees as the sort of diminishing of otherness, and that we're just encamped in the inferno of the same, which we can elaborate in a minute. But the thing is that Badiou talks about how one of Han's projects seems to be inspired by the poet Rimbaud, who wants to think of how we can do or how we can understand love afresh. What is love in a new way? To rethink, re-understand love. And for Badiou, that's a really important project. And I think for Han, he's inspired by that sort of poetic, maybe romantic desire to recapture love in an era of what Han calls pornification, where love, he believes, is impossible now in this age of the inferno of the same, of the sort of just radical proliferation of, maybe we would say, simulacra or mediated images, something along those lines. So there's a real romantic desire to sort of, in a Heideggerian sense, have a clearing of being and allow for the ontological grounding to sort of break forth and disrupt the sameness of our mundane, hyperactive postmodern lives.
So that makes sense to me, because Heidegger's point is that the question of being is motivated by our inability to philosophize, which, if you think, it's this philosophy 101, the meaning of the word philosophy incorporates the word love in terms of the philia.
Right.
The philia of
and
wisdom.
Han would say that we can't do philosophy if we can't love. And since we can't love, philosophy is sort of impossible. So for him, philosophy is the sort of, it is the translation of eros into logos. It is recognizing love, but doing so through the tools of reason. And so for him, eros sort of becomes, and he borrows this kind of thinking alongside Deleuze and Guattari, where he talks about eros is the kind of transcendental condition for thinking itself, because it is essentially disruptive. It's this event that sort of shakes us and dissolves, if you will, this just bland repetition of the inferno of the same, and confronts us with otherness and negativity. And that's something that's radically transformative, and that's something that's radically different than what our culture commonly offers us.
So so let's sort of try and talk, I guess, what's distinctive then about Han, because if the problem is sort of sameness, conventionality, homogeneity, all of these things are making the world a lot more drab. What is it that's distinctive about Han in terms of what he has to say about that? You mentioned the word neoliberalism, and lots of people on the podcast mentioned the word neoliberalism.
What the fuck is neoliberalism?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's the question. Or, I mean, the reason I say it is because, like, Heidegger was writing up until the 70s, but the term neoliberalism or its effects is something that academics, scholars, thinkers, politicians say has become much more intense as we moved towards the 21st century. So that's the question. What is neoliberalism for you?
So he doesn't spend, at least because he doesn't spend too much time defining terms. He oftentimes runs a little roughshod over things, and he's much more of like a syncretist and a synthesizer of all of these various ideas. But he does it I think in a novel approach. And so neoliberalism for him, it doesn't have some sort of rigorous definition. I think it kind of has a standard definition that's tied to postmodernity, late capitalism, maybe a sped up version of the cultural logic of capitalism. So we might say in Marxian terms that neoliberalism, or he tends to refer to late capitalism more than neoliberalism, but let's say late capitalism is the realization of real subsumption in Marxian terms. So formal subsumption and real subsumption are different for Marx. Formal subsumption is the tendency in primitive accumulation for capital to accumulate these pre-existent modes of production into the logic of capital. Real subsumption is the point at which all of these sort of modes, all of the moments of capital as value in motion have been completely incorporated into the system itself. And so Han, I actually have a quote here that he says, in late capitalism, individuals degrade into the genital organs of capital. So everything is just simply an organ of capital. Right. And I think there's something interesting too. The genital organs is important because I think there's like a libidinal element to that that's important for Han. And then also the idea of just being fully degraded into these just appendages, these libidinal appendages of capital itself. So it's this sort of pure radical intensification of real subsumption of the logic of capital.
So he's almost saying there that we're that this late capitalism that we're experiencing, the intensification of capitalism, the speeding up of capitalism, as you say, it almost sounds like he says that it's turning us into animals of some kind.
I mean, he does talk about bare life. In his book, The Agony of Eros, he does have a chapter on bare life, and he does mention that. And so one of the things that the logic of late capitalism means for him is that we are just these bodies seeking dopamine rushes through perpetual instantaneous, or instances, let's say, of pleasure. And what that does is that sort of just makes us into perpetual consumers of things that give us that pleasure. And I think there is a real sense in which that is a degradation of humanity into a form of bare life or animality. He doesn't quite say that, at least in what I've read, but I think that you're right. I think you're definitely hitting at something. It is a dehumanization in a way for him.
Mm-hmm. So like the little red notification numbers on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. That's they're giving us these real instantaneous dopamine rushes, which means that we're just pleasure-seeking animals, or that's Absolutely. What we're becoming.
Yeah, and I mean, and he talks about how it's kind of an act of worship. Every time you like, or every time you share, or every time you retweet something, it's an act of worship. So it's not just it's not like some sort of he's distancing himself from Foucault. It's not some sort of biopolitical management. It's you want to do this and you become the own cause of your self-exploitation, which he sees as being much more efficient than other exploitation, what he calls allo-exploitation, but it's auto-exploitation. And we do this because we want to like these things and we want to share these things and we want to be content producers because that is the way that we are able to achieve. He calls ourselves the achievement subject. We're able to achieve all that we can be. You know, it's like the Joel Osteen "Be the Best You" or you know, the prosperity gospels in the United States that talk about, you know, becoming a better you in the kind of process of pleasing God, and then you will be rewarded because of that. He says that all of that is the sort of this kind of hyperactive realization of this logic of late capitalism, and we do so willingly as we exploit ourselves.
I'm thinking Radiohead, you do it to yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Foucault there. You said that he's maybe that would be a helpful way of talking about what Han is trying to get to. You said, and I have a quote here. You said that he's different to Michel Foucault, the French thinker, because and Han himself says. He says the 21st century is no longer a disciplinary society, which is a Foucauldian term, but rather an achievement society.
Yeah.
So could you maybe talk to that shift, or what he's tried to articulate by saying we've gone from a disciplinary society to an achievement society?
Yeah. So in a disciplinary society, there's still an element of negativity. You must do something, or you should do something because you're under the watchful eye of the other. There's still an element of otherness. Now, of course, you do internalize that, and you become a sort of self-policing entity within the panopticon, the logic of the panopticon. But for Han, he says, and I think he sort of is building off of maybe even Deleuze's building off of disciplinary society in his postscript for control society, but maybe even fleshing that idea out a little bit more, and that the logic doesn't derive from outside, but it actually is completely internalized. And he basically says that it can be summed up in the idea of the demand to be free. So that's the logic of late capitalism, of the achievement society. You must be free. But that's not some sort of imposition from without, because we internalize that, and it becomes our own mantra of self-activity. It's what motivates us every day. And it's why we do mindfulness, and it's why businesses have chief happiness officers now, right? It's so that we can become more free as we sell our labor more rapidly under the self-exploitative logic of late capitalism. Okay,
yeah. And what do you think, Austin, what do you think in this achievement society then, what do you think is, what type of people is it producing?
Well, he says you become an entrepreneur of the self, is kind of what he says. So you become an entrepreneur of the self, and you're constantly working on yourself. But the ironic thing is, the more you work on yourself, the more guilt you impose upon yourself, and you end up becoming hyperactive, which leads to depression, anxiety, ADHD, hyperactivity disorders. And he talks about this in his book, The Burnout Society. And basically the reason this happens is because we are all products of over-positivity, over-productivity, and we exploit ourselves by sort of living in this inferno of the same at an increased rate. And he uses this distinction between infection and infarction. And I had actually never heard of the word infarction before, because I don't study medical science. But apparently, so infection is the idea of something coming from without, and infarction is a sort of imbuing or an infusing into something. So it's not something that you have to be immunized from. It's not an immunology that comes from without, or even a pharmacology, but it's something that is it just like blossoms from within, because it becomes the very logic that we ourselves want as we are seeking to become our best us, or whatever it is that we're doing. And all that does is burn us out. It leads to extreme tiredness. He believes it leads to depression rather than melancholy. Melancholy, he says, is something that occurs by having the object that we, like in the Freudian sense, the object of cathexis, the object that we invested with love and libidinal desire, and, a loved one is someone that we've literally imbued ourselves into, and then we lose that person, then we experience melancholy. That's not what depression is for him. Depression is for him is the sort of burnout and breakdown that occurs from being stuck within this self-referential, maybe circular experience of hyperactivity in the Burnout Society.
Yeah, and I can see why that has a kind of a philosophy of everyday life appeal,
right.
Because yeah, because we, I mean, even anecdotally, we know that people are more stressed, more anxious, more fatigued, you know, and burnout is a common theme.
And then when burnout happens, we're blamed, right? Like, well, you're just not eating a healthy enough diet. You're not taking enough vitamins. You're not working out enough. You're not doing something. The responsibility becomes yours because you're being burnt out by the system. And so you need to then be a better you so that you don't get burned out again. And then all that does is move the goalposts further. And exactly. And it's this endless process. So for him, he kind of, in a way, he's kind of a mystic because he advocates a sort of unplugging, and he talks about silence, and he's written a book on Zen meditation, on Zen Buddhism, and he talks about idiotism, you know, and this idea of how the earliest philosophers, you know, Socrates, he knew nothing except for one thing, that he knew nothing, right? And he talks about the sort of value of being an idiot in this sense of sort of withdrawing, of pulling yourself away, of silence, of disconnecting, of unplugging. And he thinks that isn't just some sort of negation of activity, but he actually thinks that that's the grounding of one thought, as we said earlier, but also the possibility of politics comes from that. It's this idea of an active withdrawal, an active negation of the positivity that the Burnout Society imposes on us.
Seems like a bit of a 60s throwback.
In what way are you thinking? Like going to some sort of hippie commune and what was it? Unplug and
tune in, drop out, whatever.
There it is.
Yeah. I was born in the 70s, so I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, if he's influenced by Heidegger, that is not unsurprising. You know, that these themes might be recurring again. I'm wondering, right? Is there a positive notion of freedom in what he's talking about? Or is this freedom that that it seems to be something illusory, whereby we're constantly lacerating ourselves and impugning ourselves in the name of freedom, or some type of freedom, which is not really authentic, or it's not real freedom. Does that sound right, Austin?
Yeah, I think so. It's really interesting. I actually just listened to your lovely chat with Mark Sinclair on Bergson.
Oh, yeah.
And I did PhD research with James Williams, who's a Deleuze scholar. And so I read a lot of Deleuze, which means you read a lot of Bergson. And I've been really interested in Bergson's notion of duration for a long time. And I recently just finished a book by a philosopher named Simon Glazos, I think. It's called The Politics of Speed, in which he talks about duration as being this essential disruption of the future, right? Or as Mark Sinclair called it, a qualitative multiplicity that is this sort of disruptive event that is non-spatial, right? As soon as you start to think about it, it becomes spatialized, but time then exists at this different qualitative level of disruption itself. And Han doesn't talk about Bergson from what I've read, but I think the idea of Das Nichts, or the idea of annihilation that he seems to build on with Heidegger, kind of has a similar force for him, that there is this notion of kind of the annihilation of the pure positivity of late capitalism, or let's say the qualitative disruption of this bland transparency of pleasure seeking, and what he calls the pornification of society, where everything is on display, nothing is hidden anymore, right? I think this idea of negativity, of annihilation, of duration, of the event in Deleuze, I think all of these things are sort of circling around kind of a similar tendency, or they're trying to articulate something different, or are trying to articulate something similar. And I think that's kind of what freedom then would ultimately be for him, is freedom would be the eventual disruption of the same. And it's something that's always future, but maybe not future in a temporal sense, a la Bergson's criticism of temporality as being spatial, but some sort of perpetual disruption that is constantly occurring.
Okay, yeah, because I think that then would be a good place to talk about what he means by negativity. So this is, I guess, where it gets slightly complicated. I mean, well, he's kind of sort of follows Nietzsche a little bit in this, because he seems to put a positive value on negativity,
right.
which I know, which is a contradiction in terms, I guess, or at least in the surface value. But I have a quote here from him. I think this is from the Burnout Society. He says, "Because otherness is disappearing, we live in a time that is poor in negativity." So in some sense, I mean, you probably see this in the existentialist of Sartre as well. Negativity, the idea that I can negate what I am, is something we should understand, because we can become something, or we can become something other than how we are determined. So is that how Han is understanding this role of negativity?
Yeah, it is always difficult. This is one of the things that kind of jars in my mind as I'm reading existentialists or reading Heidegger or Heideggerian scholars, and I'm trying to think about negativity as not being understood as a secondary order, but negativity as a sort of primary ontological category. And it's very difficult to think, just because the word itself we're so accustomed to thinking it as being like the negation of the things that are not, right? Like, I go into a room and is Pierre there? No, Pierre is not there. So that's the negation of the thing. But then for Sartre, that's what he calls a negatit. And what does that do is that implies the negativity that undergirds the ontological experience. So one way I've been thinking about this recently is in reference to, I've been reading this book by Sergei Prozorov called Ontology and World Politics, Void Universalism 1. And he's trying to ground a universal ontological project on the idea that the world is nothing. And it's a pretty complex philosophical argument that he goes through. It's a fantastic work, I think. But I think ultimately, without getting too bogged down and sidetracked here, what he's trying to do is he's trying to argue that once you strip away the relations of phenomenological experience, or in a Heideggerian lens, we might say the relations of the ontic, what you're left with is being, the ontological. You're left with, and for Prozorov, he's kind of following Heidegger, but then he's kind of reading Heidegger alongside Badiou, and it's this strange argument. They might sound like strange bedfellows, but it kind of worked for the argument. And so then he wants to say that this thing that's left over at the ontological, once all the relations of phenomenological or ontic reality are stripped away, is a radical multiplicity. And I think there's something interesting in that kind of maps onto what Han is doing. And I think that's also then part of the reason why Badiou wrote the preface to Agony of Eros, is that he sees in Han something intriguing that he's also trying to work through with his evental ontology, right? The difference go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Aston. Yeah, so for Badiou, what's important is that we have something should happen. Right. It's quite simple, Badiou, in a way. That has to be an event. It has to be transformative. Right. It has to change the dimensions of our world.
Exactly.
And that's, so there has to be some meaningful change. That's what negativity is then.
Right. And I think for Han, maybe the difference, and I'm not 100% sure this is my reading of Han, but I think for Han, the difference is that he's almost more Deleuzian in that events aren't rare, but it's always possible. It's always there. It's always happening. Disruption is always present. And maybe kind of for people who listened to the Bergson thing, it's this idea of this qualitative disruption. It's always happening. And I think for Han, I think negativity is potentially always there, but Burnout Society, late capitalist society, essentially covers over that. It essentially restricts our access and our ability to see that, which is why he talks about boredom and deep contemplation like Heidegger would, because those are the ways that we can not be so enamored by the images and the pleasures and the fleeting elements of positivity that just continue to burn us out, but we can attune ourselves to that clearing of being, to use the Heideggerian language, or we can attune ourselves to the negativity that is radically disruptive. And when we do that, it shocks us into thought, and it exposes us to a different way of attuning ourselves or orienting ourselves within the world.
Well, I guess there's a difference between things which are happening and things which are not happening. So everybody wants something to happen to them, Everybody wants something good, something meaningful, whether that's in terms of relationships, whether it's in terms of politics, whether it's in terms of even their job,
Right.
Even their job, everyone wants to have a job that's meaningful and fulfilling and rewarding and all of these things. But fortunately, that tends not to be the case, right?
Right.
So
it's the drab
then,
repetition of the same over and over every day,
right?
And it beats you into submission of the sameness.
Yeah, and so what he's saying then is that I guess humans in late capital, which what he means by that is how we organize our economies now.
Right.
Han is suggesting that we are overly committed to homogeneity, to sameness, to something, I guess, profoundly drab, and our lives are becoming meaningless because of it.
Maybe we can even go further, not just overcommitted, because that still implies that we have an agency outside of it. It's that we are so constituted by that logic that we have become ourselves drab beings. So that's what he calls ourselves. He says we are achievement subjects. And so it's almost that, I know it's hard to think about, but it's almost as though we ourselves have completely embodied this logic of the same. And so it's like, and the reason that negativity comes into this, and he relates it to otherness, this idea of the disruption, his point is that's all covered in the inferno of the same, because now everything is just a fantasy of my own desire, right? Everything just becomes this object that I can consume to give myself pleasure. So even sex, for example, or even quote unquote love, which he says is not really love, it's just simply the projection of my consumeristic desire onto an other object, and the otherness of that other object then becomes not other, it just becomes me. And so I really just want me reflected back to me. And that's what our entire society gives us, is this perpetual kind of self-enjoying consummation or consumption, of ourselves in quote-unquote other objects, but they're not really other. They're maybe lowercase other, and there is no real other. And it is only when we encounter the real other that we actually encounter negativity, because it's terrifying and disrupting. And for him, love, politics, philosophy are essentially disruptive and terrifying because they require the other.
Yeah, that sounds almost sounds almost Platonic, isn't it? I mean,
he does. He talks about Plato in the Agony of Eros. He's really interested, actually, in the way that Plato talks about Eros. Let me see. I wrote down a quote here, if I can find it. I don't remember where it was. What does he say? Yeah, I don't have the quote, but it's in the final. Oh, here it is. He's talking about Plato, and it's in the final chapter, or second to last chapter, in the Agony of Eros. And he says that Eros is called philosophos. It's the friend of wisdom in Plato. So the philosopher for him is a friend, a lover of wisdom. And this is why for Plato and for Han, thinking must begin with Eros, because it is the thing that allows us to be able to access Logos, which is why he says philosophy is the translation of Eros into Logos. So it is. This is why I said he's an interesting kind of syncretist, because in one chapter he'll be talking about Lars von Trier, and then he'll be talking about Heidegger, and then he'll be talking about Agamben, and then Plato, and then Deleuze and Guattari, and these thinkers that we might not at first glance think belong in the same category, but he does a really nice job of kind of weaving together, borrowing what he wants from them, and placing them into an argument that supports what it is that he's trying to get across.
Again, I guess it's because of the word negativity, I think. That's probably what people might struggle with, because, as I said already, because otherness is appearing, we live in a time that is poor in negativity. Well, I'm trying to think of how can we explain that negativity in a way that, could we give examples of it, for instance, where we could say, okay, in the Burnout Society, we're motivated, not even motivated, we've transformed ourselves to such a degree, we're hyper-narcissistic, defined by hyper-attention, or a lack of attention even, a lack of care perhaps. Would that be, could we give examples of that, do you think, Austin?
A lack of care. Well, maybe anything that would expose you and your own vulnerability would be something that would introduce you to the negativity, right? So maybe when you're taking care of a sick loved one, in that instance, you're encountering your own fragility as you kind of have projected it onto that person. But maybe at the same time, there's something that is just so excessive about the trauma of seeing a loved person in pain or dying that confronts you with your own mortality, or it confronts you with the other person's pain in a radical way that it kind of cuts through all of those positive pleasure-seeking elements of the Burnout Society. And I think one of my favorite little anecdotes is by Gilles Deleuze. He's talking about, oh God, what's the name of the short story or the novel by Dickens? Oh God, I can't remember what it's called, but it's about this guy who's a sort of drifter and everybody scorns him and hates him. And he comes into the town, and at one day he falls really sick, and he's like dying in the middle of the square. And this is a guy that everybody kind of hated. And all of a sudden, in that moment when he was dying, or he was on, it seemed that he was on his deathbed, everybody rushed to him just instantaneously, regardless of how much they hated him or didn't like him or whatever. In that moment, all of those other issues got suspended, and they rushed to his aid. And then all of a sudden he makes a recovery, and they go back to scorning him again and hating him again. And Deleuze talks about how it's in that moment that like life burst through, what he calls immanence, right? And I think there's something here too, is that you're confronted with something that is radically other, that is from the outside, that's just excessive, that doesn't exist within our matrix of everyday thinking. And for Han, that's essential for love. That's essential for politics. But our late capitalist burnout society doesn't allow that. It actually stifles all of that so that we don't ever really feel threatened. We don't ever really feel our vulnerability. And it's only in those rare instances, I don't know, maybe when you're on an airplane and you're feeling a lot of turbulence and you start to feel the real or something, you know, it's that being towards death again. And there's Heidegger again, maybe coming into this. And I think it's in those instances, that's what negativity is. Negativity is that experience of the radical otherness that is beyond or excessive of our positive everyday experience in late capitalism.
So really, it's feeling alive in a very simple, elementary sense. You know, when we feel we've lost the capacity to feel alive in the burnout society.
I think so.
And negativity is something that can help us feel what it is like to be alive.
Yeah. What is it? I don't remember if he says it, but it's like we're too alive to not do something, but we're not alive enough to do something else. It's something along those lines. It's this paradox where it's like we're basically zombies, I think, in a way. We are the walking dead in a lot of ways, I think, for Han. And this is why I think his work is so interesting, because there is this romanticism in it. It's about, even though he's quite a pessimist, I'm an optimist, so I impute an optimism into what he's saying, as though there is a possibility to experience true otherness and life, let's say, to be alive, to experience true freedom, not the freedom that capitalism says, which is be free, and be free to what? Be free to consume, and be free to consume what? Be free to consume what the market offers you insofar as the market demands that you must consume. That's not freedom. And Han recognizes that, but there's a potential for real freedom in the encounter of love and otherness. And for him, he thinks that philosophy is, in a way, the discourse or the reason on love. Love and philosophy are intertwined, and theory can help us to fall in love with life or to become alive.
Okay. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, I think it might be a useful way of illuminating what Han is trying to achieve, and that is with his critique of the multitasker. Right?
Yeah.
The figure of the multitasker. And this is from the Burnout Society as well. And I have a quote here for you. So he says, the attitude toward time and environment, known as multitasking, does not represent civilizational progress. Human beings in the late modern society of work and information are not the only ones capable of multitasking. Rather, such an aptitude amounts to a regression. Multitasking is commonplace among wild animals. It is necessary, I guess he's saying, for survival in the wilderness.
Yeah, he talks about how like a I don't remember what animal, but let's say a tiger it's got to protect its young while it's eating food and it's sniffing around and it's paying attention to the sounds of other animals in the bushes. It's multitasking. He says there's nothing superhuman about multitasking. Like, we try to say that, oh my God, you are such an amazing human because you're so busy and you have 20,000 things on your to-do list and you're juggling all these things. Wow, what a superhero you are. He says that's not anything special.
So that's actually an example of being less human.
In a way, yeah. I mean, I think this again goes to, this is why he's interested in meditation and why he's interested in this idea of withdrawal. So the Bernard Stiegler talks about the idea of the otium or the negotium, in like Stoic Roman philosophical practice, this idea that you had time carved out in your day to be able to meditate and write down in your journal about who you are and what you're struggling with and things like that, right? And Han talks about this as well as this important thing that the Burnout Society does not allow us to do. And that's maybe what, for him, a truly human activity would be, is not the hyperactivity where we don't even have time to think, but rather the times when we can just completely separate and engage in this act of self-reflection, of self-criticism, and not be so consumed by these objects of consumption. And I think we need to make it clear too that objects of consumption here don't just mean I go to the store and I buy food, or I go on Twitter and I go to Netflix and I consume images. It's everything. It's from the way that we shake hands with people. It's the business meetings that we set up. It's the laughter that we exchange over beers. All of those things, I think, for him are sullied by this logic. So everything becomes an encounter of consumption. And so that we can't even enjoy laughter with our group of friends over some beers in an authentic way, because all we're doing is consuming this laughter for our own enjoyment. Now, I don't think that we should take this and be like, oh my God, we're in despair. There is no such thing as truth ever, ever, ever. But I think his point is that this is the dominant logic of today, and it has great hold over us. And if there is a criticism that I would level against Han, is that he's not clear enough about those elements of remainder that we do get to experience, that even make us, like, how the fuck can he write this book? If we're really that inculcated, then how could he write this book? So obviously there's a sense in which we're able to attest to the beyond or to the otherness of negativity or something like that. So it's still there. He just doesn't focus on that as much because he's a bit of a pessimist.
Okay, yeah. He does a little, I think. I mean, when he talks about multitasking and what you call hyperattention, what you've mentioned as hyperattention in Han, he says that as sort of an alternative to that, and I guess you kind of alluded to this when you talked about Stoicism, is he says that we should take up sort of boredom, in a sense. Boredom is a way out, if you like, perhaps, or an alternative to the Burnout Society. Boredom, deep contemplative attention. So I was wondering, could you maybe speak about that, because you've already I know some of your background is in theology, and you've already mentioned how he talks about some Zen practices. Could you maybe perhaps elaborate on what Han means by boredom and deep contemplative attention?
So I think boredom is something he takes straight out of Heidegger. And it is this ontological mood that opens us up to being, right? It is, it's almost that there's this poetic attention to the elemental, right? To nature that I think we get in Han. And I mean, I don't think that this is like some sort of smooth process that unites us with the one. It's some sort of disruptive encounter with the nothingness, the das Nicht, the other that is essential in being. And so boredom is an attunement or a sort of orientation, let's say, away from the burnout, the options that a Burnout Society offers to us, and away from this logic of late capitalism, away from all of that speed that he sees as being problematic that doesn't allow us to actually recognize, I guess, love or whatever else. And so I
for
think
Heidegger, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry to cut across you. But
That's
for
okay.
Heidegger, I think boredom is, what's interesting about it is kind of a motivator. He's not saying be bored, or it's good to be bored. And I think Heidegger's idea is that sort of boredom makes you, what it does is it puts you where you are. Because when one is bored, like you're waiting for a train or a bus or whatever, the one excruciating thing about it is that you can't go anywhere other than where you are. It illuminates the world in place. It illuminates the world, the bus station, the seats that you're sitting on. And in that way, then it's an opening onto something maybe more positive, or onto questions of what's meaningful and authentic, and how you might, go, okay, well, what can I do? Here I am. What can I do, to make,
Right.
What is my life like? That is such a way that I can send it in a different direction.
Yeah, maybe. I had a guy hit me up on Twitter and ask me. I don't remember how. I was doing another podcast and I mentioned something and he reached out to me and we were talking about like the breaking of the fourth wall in postmodern film or in like Brechtian theater or something like that. And so he said, is breaking the fourth wall kind of an everyday experience? Does that ever happen to you? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you're like talking to someone and you feel like that this isn't all there is. And I said, well, do you mean that somehow that this just seems like BS? You're talking with someone and then you're like, wait a second, what you're saying is only what you heard on Fox News or what you read in, The Guardian. And there's like this disconnect and you start to kind of get a peek behind the veil. And he said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. He's like, what is that experience? And I think that this idea of boredom in Heidegger and in Han is precisely that. It's when the contingent relations of the world show themselves as not being necessary, you get kind of a glimpse behind the veil. And that's why boredom, that's why being unplugged, that's why meditation all have import for Han, is because they get us behind the veil. But they're practices that we can engage in. You don't have to simply rely on the random occurrence. It's something that you can actually maybe proactively engage in and stimulate the practice of experiencing beyond the veil even more so. And I think that's one of the things that for him philosophy does. And that, I think that's exactly what philosophy is for him.
I really like that, the idea of sort of breaking the third wall in the real world. That's awesome. Yeah, because I just think like, what's the corollary of that? The negative corollary of that is like, you got the Friends laugh track in your mind all the time.
Exactly.
How awful is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, right, yeah. Now, one of the things, I'm not sure if you've picked up on this, is one of the things that interested me in what I've read in Han is it kind of made sense to me, and again, in a sort of a sense of a philosophy of everyday life, which is the idea of, on top of boredom, on top of deep contemplative attention, he talks about this thing called deep tiredness, right? And it's like, I don't know, it's like, when you're with your friends in an evening and it's this sort of a sense of deep contentment.
Yeah, exactly.
Takes you out of yourself and puts you into a group, or puts you. They're the type of moments that we should be, I guess, pursuing. They're the real moments. Right. Is that something that you have any thoughts about in relation to Han?
Yeah.
Is there something to that? Yeah.
Yeah. There's something. It's almost as though when we're tired for Han, that we aren't as caught up in the hyperactivity of the achievement society or the burnout society, right? And tiredness is kind of the occurrence of the excess breaking through, right? It's like a moment that allows us to not be so caught up in needing to be this entrepreneur of the self. We don't need to we don't have the energy to just simply keep creating and becoming a better us. And it's almost as though in those moments of tiredness, we become a little more free for Han. And there's an excellent short little book by Jonathan Crary called 24/7, in which he talks about, in our late capitalist society, the only time that we are disconnected from or unplugged from the capitalist system is when we're asleep. That's the only time we're not being exploited now. Every other moment outside of that, images are coming to us. We're thinking about the next meeting we have to go to. We're preparing, like, what is our list for tomorrow? Someone's sending you an email. We're 24/7 bombarded with things, and it's really almost impossible to disconnect, except when we're asleep. And I think there's something similar going on here for Han. It's not as radical. It's not a complete unplugging, but there's just something about this idea of being tired that is a resistance to capitalism, because capitalism doesn't stop. It is the complete resistance to entropy, right? And in a way, then it's the complete resistance to the reality of life. I mean, entropy is real, and capitalism resists that. I mean, economists, they cannot talk about entropy. Like capitalist economists, microeconomists, neoclassical economists, they cannot, because it doesn't exist in their world. Because capitalism must be sustained by endless growth. It must. And when you start to be like, yes, but you do realize that everything is slowly dwindling down to heat death, right? From order to disorder. This is happening. You can resist all you want, but you are fighting against ontology itself, or you are fighting against nature, or you're fighting against physics. It jars with their mind. And so I think sleep and tiredness is the sort of manifestation of frailty. It's the manifestation of weakness. It's the manifestation of otherness. Maybe it's a brief glimpse into death in a way. And it's in those moments that you aren't so caught up in just producing for the market.
Right. So it's like when you become tired, what's happening? Well, your body's starting to shut down, you get sleepy, you need to recharge, basically,
Right.
I know you need to recharge for tomorrow's day of work and multitasking or whatever.
And you get delirious and you say stupid things and you laugh at stupid things and you forget things. You're not efficient. And capitalism requires efficiency. And tiredness is the sort of contrast to that.
Yeah, and it's like, and sleep deprivation is a form of torture also.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in a way, I think that he would say there's a sense in which that torture of sleep deprivation is inherent in the logic of the Burnout Society, which is why we get burnt out, which is why hyperactivity is not, or even multitasking is not some positive thing. It's the opposite of what our bodies are capable of sustaining.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a good place to end, actually. Deep tiredness. I mean, although I do worry, Austin, that even our dreams, even our dreams might be being colonized as well by capitalism or hyperactivity. We're going to a situation where we get like, oh my God, I'm dreaming. You start dreaming of all the sort of the deadlines you have at work and things like that.
Yeah, and exactly. And then even sleep is used as a way of social reproduction, right? It's so you can be rested, so you can be more efficient the next day. So make sure you get your 8 hours and take your melatonin at night before you go to sleep and do whatever else, or your CBD oil or whatever it is that you do so that you can rest better and produce more, right? And so there is still something insidious about that I don't know. And it's only a matter of time. I mean, just wait until some business person is like, I have found a way to be able to charge the electricity in your house by plugging your finger into a socket while you're sleeping that uses the electrical pulses of your body. I mean, it's not, come on. Is that really that far out of the realm of possibility? It doesn't seem it.
I don't think so. Yeah. So I think he's talking then about these, I don't know, like trying to reconnect to his deep, meaningful activities that remind us of what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
Trying to find things that are exceptional or unique or have a degree of otherness to them, which allows us to transfigure or to refresh our lives. Is that right?
I mean, again, I wish he would focus on that more. I think it's there. And I think that yes, he would, if we were sitting down with him and talking with him, I think he would say, I would like to maximize those instances of human experience and minimize the ones that are conditioned by the logic of late capitalism. But he doesn't spend as much time talking about that. And so, like I said, if I was going to level my big criticism against him, it would be that. And it's because analysis and diagnosis is really important, but I am always looking for, okay, so then what do we do? Like what do we do about this? How do we give people hope? And even if it's a sort of strange understanding of hope, I want to build some sort of political or communal or societal or ethical notion that can give people something beyond just the dire diagnosis that everything is terrible.
Where do you see that then? I mean, you must see it. You said it already. I mean, where do you see the alternative, the hopes? What kind of practices have you observed either in literature, philosophy, scholarship, or in everyday life, which can, I guess, supplement what Han is talking about?
Yeah, for me, I think that there are a few ways to do it. I think that political organizing and community is so important. In an era where families are not the stable entity that they're maybe propped up to be all the time, or where political, and when I say political, I don't necessarily mean electoral politics, but I mean local trade union activity. Or I'm a part of a reading group here in Sydney where we get together and we read articles from Jacobin, and we sit around and we talk strategy, and we talk about the things that interest us or that frighten us. Today we actually just had a meeting and we talked about the exciting sort of leftist movements in UK and in America and in Mexico with the election of AMLO. And we talked about some of the potential pitfalls, but then at the same time, don't despair and wallow in that, and think about how we can continue to build productive programs of community together. And then at the same time, I think art. For me, art is something that is so important. I've done a lot of work in film and television and stage, and I do podcasting and things like that. And for me, it's this idea of creating alongside people. And this is why philosophy is so powerful for me, is because I really do agree with Han that philosophy and eros, that there is something erotic about philosophy. And I don't mean sexual, but there is this incitement of joy that can come through questioning and thinking and pondering. And yes, it can open up doors to depressing and terrible things as well. But there's something for me enlivening about the creative practice of philosophy that I think you also see in art and in literature and in film. And it's just trying to make connections with other people and with other forms of that expression that can stoke that joy within the communities that you're a part of as you build those communities, and they kind of become the glue that build those communities themselves. They're not perfect. It's not like that there is a perfect art community that you slip into. It's becoming a part of communities together. Like, as stupid as it sounds, I think even something like this podcast, like for me, when I listened to that talk with you and Mark Sinclair, I was like, yes, like I got a burst of energy. And then I was out having drinks on Friday night with my buddy Alex, who's a philosopher, and I was telling him about Bergson's notion of duration, and we were both sitting there and we were talking about this idea of qualitative multiplicity, and we were like, I don't know what that means, but it's awesome. And it's those moments that when society is so hard on us and it's imposing so many demands for more and for faster, that when you can have those moments to slow down and talk and have those creative connections, I think for me that's kind of where I like to build out on maybe some of the areas that Han is suggesting that we should build out.
Okay, I think that's really nice, and it's encouraging and it's positive, and I think it's a good place to end before we go back to the Burnout Society.
Yeah, exactly.
Before you go, Austin, tell us about give us your podcast and your YouTube channel, if you want to give them a plug, because they're well worth listening to.
No, cool. So especially for people out there who are like philosophy educators or they're interested in philosophy more, I am a producer and researcher for the Wisecrack YouTube channel, and we make philosophical, or now we're even starting to do scientific and psychological analyses of film, television, pop cultural figures, things like that. So you can check us out on YouTube. I also co-host their movie podcast. It's called Show Me the Meaning, and we do, hour-long deep dives into sometimes classics of cinema or sometimes whatever the next I don't know, like BS Marvel film is that comes out that people want us to talk about. But like we did The Shining last week. And then I also co-host a philosophy podcast with a buddy of mine who's a philosophy professor in Southern California. And it's called Owls at Dawn. And we do philosophy, politics, religion. We both have theology backgrounds, so we kind of talk a little bit about theology as well. So you can check that out.
Outstanding.
Come on, Jimmy. Who are you going to fight against when this balloon of yours goes up?
Thank you for listening to The Well. Our theme tune is Love the Government by Il Papa Giraffe and is licensed under Creative Commons. You can follow us on iTunes or your preferred podcast app.
Trotskyists, union leaders, communist union leaders, atheists, agnostics,